Welcome back. Christmas shopping, changeable weather conditions, and even the Super Bowl are all examples of how seasonality can have a very real impact on sales. However, despite being one of the most frequently applied statistical patterns to improve the results of forecasts, it's often a field which isn't well understood and is rarely well applied. So Johannes, we often talk about seasonality as being one of the core patterns that are applied to improve the accuracy of forecasts. But what do we actually mean by this? What are the other core patterns?
So the seasonality is one of the main cyclicities. There are, I would say, three major cyclicities, which are the time of the year. So that's what people typically refer as seasonality. You have the day of the week cyclicity, and you have the time of the day cyclicity. So that's the three mains. You have a couple of secondary cyclicities, such as the paycheck effect. I'm not sure if it's the academical term. It's referred to basically the monthly cyclicity, where you have effect with people getting paid or things happening at the beginning of the month or the end of the month. And you have also what I would refer also as a minor cyclicity, quasi-seasonality. Things such as Easter, Ramadan, Chinese New Year. So it happens every year, but not exactly at the same time of the year, at least according to the Gregorian calendar. So we have all those cyclicities that are, I would say, and seasonality is a very important one of them. And then other patterns besides those cyclicities, we have just the level. What is your baseline for demand, and the trend, how much the whole thing is growing or shrinking over time, and finally one that is kind of the opposite, the amount of statistical noise, which is also a very big pattern in the sense that you need to really understand in depth the erraticity and if what you're seeing is noise or actual statistical pattern.
Okay, so let's talk about seasonality itself then. Why is it something that people struggle with? Because I mean, it's fairly obvious to know that sort of come Christmas, sales are going to spike, and around holiday seasons, you're going to see different sales for different things. So why is it something people struggle with?
So seasonality is difficult to get right. So let's review a bit the challenges. The first challenge is that most products are short-lived on the market. I mean, when I say short-lived, I think the average lifetime of an FMCG product is something between 3 and 5 years. Which means that if you have a product that on average, you're selling products that on average last 3 years on the market, it means that half of your products have only 1 year and a half of existence. And you even have 1/3 of your products that have less than a year. So if you want to have like a very, I would say, naive seasonal statistical model, where you say, the sales that I'm going to do for next Christmas are going to be similar to what I did for previous Christmas. Well, it turned out that for 1/3 of your products, there wasn't a last Christmas. So you don't have any reference. So that the first challenge is that because you have products that there is product novelty in the market, you end up with a significant portion of your catalog that doesn't have 1 year existence. And even, let's say, for example, for car parts, where a single part, they are more long-lived, so they're going to live, let's say, 6 years. Even if you say, and that's already, I would say, a fairly long-lived product, it still means that 1/6 of your product don't even have 1 year of sales. So you're going to have, you will not be able to apply this naive seasonality to a sizable portion of your catalog.
Okay, so that's one of the problems we kind of face with seasonality. So what are some of the other problems that we kind of face?
So the other problem are the fact that seasonality is not necessarily exactly the same from 1 year to another. So yes, Christmas is the 25th of December every year, but if you go from 1 year to another, the Christmas season, I would say from the merchant perspective, tend to vary when it starts from one year to another. Maybe because 1 year it started to be very cold earlier, as soon as October, so people started to do like winter shopping earlier in the season, or on the contrary, temperature were better, longer, so people did start to buy later. Also, sometimes you even have the political climate. If people are very worried about the future, they might decide to postpone to the last minute their Christmas purchase. I mean, you have tons of effects, and that's typically referred as time distortion. So you still have the Christmas peak, for example, but it might actually, when the Christmas season starts, might actually vary from a few weeks from 1 year to the next. And that happens for all those seasonal patterns. They can be distorted from 1 year to the next. So that's probably the second class of problem. And the third class of problem is that your seasonality, unfortunately, is polluted also by other patterns. So what if, for example, last year, in September, you did a massive promo that you're not repeating this year? Then you should not, I would say, confuse the fact that you had a massive promo last year that you're not going to repeat with seasonality. So you need to de-entangle seasonality from the other patterns. So that, and all those changes combined, make seasonality much more elusive than if you just think the naive situation where you have like a pure seasonality that is for a product that is very long-lived and very stable, and everything works very smoothly.
Okay, so let's talk about overcoming some of those problems then. If we start off with the historical data, if you haven't got historical data for, say, a third of your catalogue, can you actually use seasonality in forecasting for those products?
Yes, but you need to start looking at your products as a collection instead of looking at products one by one. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, let's say, if you have winter boots and you're selling winter boots, there will be something like a shared seasonal pattern for all those products, or at least you can reasonably assume that such, I would say, a shared seasonality does exist. So that means that if you can identify this shared seasonality, it doesn't matter if this year you're selling winter boots that are not the same winter boots than the one that you sold last year. You could say, okay, I know that for winter boots in aggregate, I have this pattern, and thus when I am pushing to the market a new product for which I have zero sales history, I can from day one apply a seasonal pattern, just because I'm going to recycle somehow something that was based on an aggregate for all the winter boots. So that's the key insight, is to look, instead of looking at the depth of history, you look at the width of products.
Okay, and so then we're talking about sort of that time. I mean, if you're forecasting for months in advance, how are you going to know whether summer is going to be elongated by an extra month? Say, for example, we're having a nicer summer. Like, how do you actually know that? How can you forecast for that?
So here we are going into the next stage, which is how do we deal with all the distortions? It can be done analytically, and the technique has been known as dynamic time warping. So if people are interested, they can look it up on the Wikipedia. And by the way, dynamic time warping is exceedingly complicated to implement software-wise. And it's very interesting because about 10 years ago, the community that was doing voice recognition, machine learning for voice recognition, had to deal with dynamic time warping. It was too complicated, they gave up and they went to deep learning. And that's the interesting thing, is that Lokad actually did the exact same thing for seasonality, where we implemented in our forecasting engine number 4 dynamic time warping, and we gave up and basically replaced the whole thing with deep learning in the latest generation of our forecasting engine.
So it sounds very sci-fi, time warping. Could we just have a quick overview of what it is?
The overview is that that your season is probably going to end soon. You don't know when, but you can account for the variability. And basically the sort of things that you want to make sure of is that if the season ends early, you will see the drop. So we say, oh, I've reached the end of the season, so I drop. I know that the demand that will be ongoing will be much lower. But beware, if you were doing so what does it look like, a seasonality analysis without this kind of dynamic time warping? If the season ends early, what happens is that you have your new baseline, your new level, and you say, according to my seasonality profile, demand first week of December is supposed to be like half of the last week of August. That's your static rigid profile. But the problem is that if the summer ended early and that by the last week of August you are already out of your summer season, you do not want to divide your demand again by factor 2 on the first week of September just because, usually from the last week of August to the first week of September, demand was dropping. Here you are in a situation where demand has already dropped. So dynamic time warping is basically a technique that doesn't let you predict any better the transition between seasons, but that lets you avoid, I would say, compounding errors where the season start late or early, and you apply your seasonality profile twice. You end up having first a drop of demand, and then you reapply your seasonal pattern that seems to indicate that there will be a further drop, or the opposite. You have entered early the season, demand has already spiked to a new plateau, and because it started earlier, you say normally it was supposed to start at this moment, and then you reapply this factor on top. So that's what the time warping does. It does not tell you if the season will start earlier or sooner.
So basically the idea behind it is you're going to have the same sort of demand profile, but it's just being either compressed or elongated along the season. Okay, and then the last thing we sort of spoke about was sort of historical spikes in data.
Yes.
And not transferring those spikes in order for a seasonality for this year.
Yes.
How does that actually work then? How do you not take those into account? How do you know what is seasonal demand and what is just a spike due to a promotion or something like that?
So the classical approach for, let's say, time series forecasting is a parametric decomposition. So you have your history of demand, and you would say, out of this demand, those 100 units, there will be this amount that are basically the baseline, this amount that are the seasonality factor, this amount that can be explained with the trend, this amount that can be explained with this and this and this. So you have like an explicit decomposition of your demand. And fundamentally, this approach is very weak in the sense that you want to be able to learn all your patterns independently, but the reality is your historical data, everything is completely, I would say, mixed together. So the reality is that I would say there are at least two angles to this problem. First, you need to properly record in your historical data your promotions and your stockouts and all the other events that were impacting not the demand, but the observation that you have of the demand that are the sales. So the sales do not equate the demand. For example, when you want to forecast, you typically want to say, I want to forecast the demand for the regular price. I don't want to forecast the demand for a super low promotional price. So, what you have in your sales history, what you have in your history is your sales, and the sales, unfortunately, are distorted because of the promotions and possibly stockouts and plenty of things. So, first thing is that you need to record all the factors that were distorting your perception of the demand, which is more tricky than it sounds. I mean, there is very few companies that nowadays have, I would say, a very precise recording of all the events that influence their sales. That can be things such as if you're in e-commerce, remembering if a product was part of the homepage or was prominently featured in a section, if a product was part of a newsletter, if there was all the price movements that were for the products. And even if you have like competitive intelligence, remember the price of your competitors, because maybe you had a drop of demand at a given day, not because you had a stock out, but because you had a competitor who are doing a massive promotion and you did not align your price on their price for this given day. And that explains the drop of demand. So all of that is the first part of the recipe. The second is you need, I would say, a machine learning setup where you can learn jointly all those patterns. So one of the trick of, I would say, modern machine learning is that you do not try to learn the statistical patterns in isolation. So you don't try to learn seasonality first, then trend, then I would say promotional effect, and then you don't decompose all of that. You typically have a model that is jointly trying to capture all those patterns, and you try this model at once. So that means that the model needs to have like the capacity to learn all this diversity of patterns. So you need a very, very expressive model. And that's one of the reasons why nowadays I would say a lot of people in the machine learning community have gone, I would say, the deep learning boat. It's because deep learning is just like an approach to generate model that can capture a very wide variety of patterns.
Okay, we keep on mentioning this word distortions, and it seems like there's so many possible ways for data to be distorted.
Yes.
And for actually seasonality to be very difficult to implement.
Yes.
So is there any way we can really have full confidence in the results, because there's always going to be some distortions to your data, right?
Absolutely, and the question is how much does the past let you predict the future? That's at the core root assumption behind statistical demand forecasting, and unfortunately the answer is to some extent the future cannot be predicted by the past. So but still the problem is that first, this is not so true, fortunately, when we are talking of forecasts that are up to a few months ahead. Why? Because most markets have a lot of inertia. So, the recent past is still a reasonable approximation of the near future. And that's what we leverage. The cyclicities are relatively strong, so it's very observed. It's whenever there are, I would say, human affairs, everything follows this yearly cyclicity. And it has probably gone for thousands of years. Humans are a matter of habits, so they have very strong habits. I mean, and you can see the results in those habits in practically every single time series that represent, human affairs. I mean, if you look at how many passengers you have in airplanes, that will follow a yearly curve. How much people are buying milk at any given day of the year, there will be a seasonality curve. How much they are buying video games, how much they are for practically everything, you have this seasonality, even electricity consumption and whatnot. So it has been very stable, and you can leverage that. But indeed, you have a lot of the future that is like the irreducible uncertainty. And that's where typically this probabilistic approach that we have shine, and it's also for seasonality. So your seasonal patterns are stable, but they are not invariant. So that means also that seasonality can evolve from one year to another, and so you want to have a statistical model that even if you cannot predict the evolution, you can predict the average rate of evolution, which will let you introduce the right amount of uncertainty in your forecast. And the uncertainty will be ejected by the fact that the forecast is a probability distribution that embed the seasonality pattern, but not like a perfect seasonality, like a fuzzy seasonality, where it's both fuzzy in terms of amplitude, how much uplift will you have for your peak season, but also an uncertainty that is time-wise, when does it start? So it's a combination of the two.
Okay, and sort of round things up, What can companies do to improve their approach to forecasting so that it takes more into account seasonality?
Probably to give us a phone call at Lokad. That's me being very, very salesy. I believe that probably I would say the big step is to transition toward machine learning setups. So I would say the old school approach of doing seasonality is to manually craft seasonality profiles. So basically you create buckets of products and you say, well, all the products that are in this bucket, they share the same seasonality. Why? Because I said so, I'm the expert. Usually the problem is not that the expert said so is wrong, is that I would say a supply chain expert can have a fairly good assessment that all those products share the same seasonality. The problem is that it's a nightmare to maintain, and so over time it tends to degenerate. So it requires too much manual input and cannot be properly maintained. So the idea is that you create buckets of products where you say same seasonality, but then it means that whenever you're launching a new product, you need to make sure that the product lands in the right bucket. And typically when you build initially your seasonality profile, your seasonality buckets, the whole clustering is quite good, but it tends to degenerate and it's very hard to maintain that over time. And so it becomes very poor. And my advice would be if you can transition toward the machine learning setup, then it means that you can at least maintain your seasonal buckets automatically. And that will give you, I would say, a significant boost in accuracy just because, okay, your buckets may not be perfect, but they don't degenerate over time. They are regenerated every time you need them.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to have to wrap things up there for today, but thanks for your time. Okay, that's everything for this week. We'll be back again next week with another episode, but until then, thanks for watching.